let me go ahead and introduce Ralph. Ralph Smith has been involved in the Federal Labor Employee Relations Program since 1973, so pre-Civil Service Reform Act. He worked for several agencies in Washington, D.C., including the FLRA and OPM. He was a Labor Employee Relations Officer and Deputy Personnel Officer for NASA in Huntsville, Alabama, before founding FPMI, the Federal Personnel Management Institute. He worked closely with the Society of Federal Labor Relations Professionals when it was first created. So he's an early adopter of the society from way back when. He's also the founder of FedSmith, and many of you read FedSmith articles, and we'll give you more information about his company and FedSmith and how you can read more about labor and employee relations from the company FedSmith. During his career, Ralph authored a number of books, a number of papers, and he just recently authored a paper called Federal Workforce Changes Likely in the Second Trump Administration. And that's what this presentation is about today. We obviously expect significant changes as a result of the Trump administration coming into power on January 20th. So he's going to talk about what he knows from his past experience. We have a PowerPoint presentation, which we will share with everyone via email who has attended this session. We'll also put it in the chat room so you can just copy it directly from the chat room. So without further ado, Ralph Smith. Ralph, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Rich. I appreciate it. I wanted to mention, first of all, why am I doing this? Because I've gotten a few calls from people over the last 20 years asking me to speak, and I used to do a lot of speaking. I worked at OPM and FLRA, and then, as Rich mentioned, I ran a company called FPMI, where we did conferences and training sessions around the country and actually around the world in some places. But when I saw the note from Rich, my usual reaction is, no, I'm not interested. I'm at least semi-retired, and I don't want to do that. It takes a lot of work, and I like not working. But Rich is highly respected in the community, so I gave it a second thought. And the more I thought about it, wrote the article about changes coming. Labor relations has been, the last several years, kind of boring, at least from my perspective. Obviously, I'm not working in an office. I don't work for a union. I'm not a member of the Biden administration. I'm not in the Trump administration and won't be. What I do is write occasional articles for the company called FedSmith. But since labor relations tended to get kind of boring the last several years, I've been writing more about the thrift savings plan. People found it more interesting to read about the 155,324 millionaires that are now in the TSP instead of an article about the latest FLRA case that doesn't really affect many people and hasn't gotten much publicity anyway. So I did want to take the chance to address this group. And when I first sat down, Rich asked me for a biography, and I thought, well, I guess I've had at least 20 years experience. Turned out it's 53 or something. I don't know why time flies so fast, but there it is. My agenda, some of these things are very, I understand they're upsetting. At first, I decided to try to make it entertaining, and then I thought, well, there's maybe 50,000 federal employees that might lose their job. I can't think of a way to make that entertaining. So I'm just going to be very direct in going through a lot of the stuff that I have put together that I hope will be of interest. Go to the first slide, if you would, Rich. And when I first started talking about this and thinking about it, what came to mind was Mark Twain, and he had a statement that he wrote back before the Civil War. History does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And in part, I don't know how many of the people listening were active in labor relations back in the 1970s. I'm guessing not a lot, but this does sound a lot like what we were going through back in the mid-70s. Go to the next slide, Rich. At that time, some of you may remember Jimmy Carter, president, and a lot of similarities between the Carter administration and the Biden administration. And as Mark Twain said, it rhymes, it's not just the same. And Jimmy Carter wanted to make government efficient. And one way to do that was to put a lot more emphasis on performance, make it a lot easier to move people around in government, and make it run more like a business. The AFG national president at the time was a guy named Ken Blaylock. Ken worked as a plumber down in South Alabama, not too far from where a well-known country singer started a little bit before he became the president. Ken obviously had a lot of intelligence and went from being a plumber at an Air Force base in Montgomery to becoming the national president of AFGE. Of course, Jimmy Carter, like any politician who gets to be president, has a political agenda. And he got Ken Blaylock to go around the country, basically giving the unions approval for the Civil Service Reform Act. Prior to the CSRA, obviously, there had been an executive order that President Kennedy had issued. President Nixon revised it some. Nixon could have just eliminated it, didn't for whatever reason. And the AFGE's primary interest was in having a law that couldn't be changed with a stroke of a pen, and he got it. It didn't work out so well for Ken Blaylock. The union lost some members. He lost an election, so he wasn't the national president after the next election, after the CSRA passed. But Jimmy Carter got what he wanted, so that's how it worked out. Carter lost the election. If those of you who were there then, you remember that inflation was a big deal. If I remember personally, I went to get a mortgage. We wanted to build a cabin on a lake in rural Tennessee. And I went to the credit union and they said, we can do that. And the interest rate is 18%. That killed the idea of the cabin on a lake in Tennessee, at least for a few years. A couple of years later, fortunately, we were able to work it out and it was only at 11%. So high inflation was a big deal. And at one point, I worked for OPM in a place called Thomas Circle in Washington. And about the same time, or during that same time, walking out at lunch one day, I encountered a group of Iranian protesters protesting American involvement in their country in the Mideast. Under Carter, Iran took a number of hostages, and that politically that was very harmful to the Carter campaign. So Iran was involved, inflation was involved, an election came up, and Ronald Reagan got to be elected. When President Reagan came in, obviously he was from the conservative state of California, where he'd been the governor, and the same state that elected Richard Nixon as governor. Obviously, California has changed a lot since then. When President Reagan came in, he ended up firing 11,000 air traffic controllers. PATCO, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, was decertified, and some other employees ended up also losing their union representation in the government. So when I say the history rhymes, you went from a liberal Democrat interested in labor relations in the federal government, employer relations in the federal government, followed by a conservative Republican, and I'm putting Donald Trump in the category of a conservative Republican, after a liberal president has gone in and people, for whatever reason, inflation, political concerns about Iran, et cetera, President Reagan took over then, pretty much as I would see President Trump taking over now. Go ahead, Rich, to the next one. At that time, Don Devine came into OPM. I was working at OPM at the time he came in, and there were a lot of expressed concerns about a person with his background coming into the government. He wanted to reduce the federal workforce, wanted to cut spending on government benefits, and to some extent, he he accomplished that, at least with regard to cutting some expenses. I came into the government under the Civil Service Reform Act. I'm sorry, Civil Service Retirement System. Uh, that changed under the Reagan administration to the Federal Employees Retirement System. So there are differences. I'm not going to go into what those differences are. If you work for the government, you don't care about CSRS unless you're older than I am. Uh, PERS is now what everybody goes into automatically. So Devine came in, unions didn't like him. He got a lot of negative publicity. And despite all the publicity, all the discussion about reducing the size of the federal workforce, by the time Reagan administration ended, the government number of government employees had increased by about 4%. So something happened. And what happened, I think, is in part what we're probably likely to see, not too dissimilar at the final result, a little bit different. Go to the next slide, Rich. Don Devine isn't around now. Most of us had probably not heard of Vivek Ramaswamy until perhaps the Republican primary, and he participated in some debates with other potential presidential nominees. Ramaswamy is a bright guy. He has a degree in biology from Harvard. He has a degree in law from Yale. He's an entrepreneur. He's in the billionaire class. He's founded a couple of companies, and he has a lot of ideas about the American dream. His parents were from India, and he has, to some extent, or to a large extent, lived the American dream. You don't get to be in the billionaire class without having a lot of sense and a lot of hard work, and he has done it. But this gives you some idea where he's coming from. And the reason I mentioned it is the Department of Government Efficiency is coming into existence. If anybody follows them on X, what used to be Twitter, you'll see comments like these posted throughout the Twitterverse. With popular vote, the Republicans control both chambers of Congress. They have a 6-3 majority on the Supreme Court. It's now or never to structurally reform the federal government. The next 4 years would be the last opportunity America has to dismantle the administrative state and usher in a modern revival of 1776. So Mr. Ramaswamy is serious. He's coming in. They're looking for people to join DOGE, and you can apply on X if you're so inclined. They indicate they're going to interview the top 1% of applicants, and you get to work, they say 80 hours a week, and there's no pay. So they want true believers. They want people to come in and give them ideas on how to restructure government. They want to cut spending. They want to cut the benefits. And in a few minutes, I'll talk about the immediate impact on labor relations people as well as other government employees. Go ahead to the next slide, Rich. His partner in this, and maybe he's the partner to Elon Musk. Everybody, I think, has probably heard of Elon Musk. He's actually was born in South Africa, has Canadianship, South African citizenship, and American citizenship. The guy is a genius. I have read his biography some time ago, and some of the stuff he's accomplished has been extraordinary. And he was not known as a political person. I don't think he was a political person, but he has become that. Over the last 2 years, he's campaigned for Donald Trump. He's bought Twitter with an extra $44 billion he had laying around, changed Twitter to X, and he wants to change the government to make it more efficient. So between Musk, Ramaswamy, they're going to be going into agencies. Elon Musk has said recently that he thinks there are hundreds of federal agencies that can be eliminated or significantly reduced. On the other hand, he also said that nobody he's talked to can tell him how many agencies there are. Nobody seems to know. and his an AI presentation or AI program that it couldn't find the answer either. It depends on a lot of variables, but there are hundreds, and he wants to eliminate some of them. On the other hand, if you look at what he said uh, on X, he said that this he developed a program called Grok, Grok, artificial intelligence. So I went into Grok and I asked it about the Department of Government Efficiency and Elon Musk. And what came back is that the program involves economy, eliminating people, changing regulations so that it doesn't present as much of a burden on the American public, and slashing hundreds of agencies. But according to Grok, which is owned by Musk, the actual execution of slashing hundreds of agencies seems more rhetorical than practical, given the complexity of American governance and the checks and balances system. It's more on efficiency, cost reduction, and rolling back regulations and outright eliminating agencies. And they're already, if you look on X, they're posting stuff about programs in government that have, in their view, wasted hundreds of billions of dollars. And if you look at some of the stuff they're citing, it probably is a waste of hundreds of billions of dollars. Things from studying bees drooling to male prostitutes in Saigon, and how do they live and how can we help them? Stuff like that, which for most voters comes across as, I don't want my tax dollars going for that. Go ahead, Rich, to the next slide. Several things I think are likely to happen. Again, looking back to Mark Twain, it's not going to be exact, but it's going to rhyme. This is the second Trump administration coming in. And we're already seeing some proposals coming out and it's having an impact. First is already being told this is what's going to happen, ordering return of employees to offices. And again, if you read news articles, hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of federal employees are saying, if I have to go back to work in the office in Washington or San Francisco or wherever it happens to be, I'm going to quit. I'm not going to give up telework work or give up work in a remote location and go back to an office. It's less productive in their view. It's less convenient. It costs them more money and they don't want to do it. How that will happen, how it will play out, I don't really know. Based on what happened under Carter, although we didn't have the telework that was going on at that time, people who were eligible to retire will probably use that as the final straw and they will probably leave quickly. A lot of the people threatening to retire are young, they're starting out. They might quit if they have other job opportunities. A lot of the people, when it comes right down to it, will look at their government job, the salary they're making, the benefits they get, the opportunities that may or may not be present in the private sector. And if they quit, it's probably going to take them a while to do it. But what they hope to accomplish, they being DOGE, is to get people to quit. That's one way to reduce the size of the federal workforce quickly, at least in theory. I think you're also going to see, and of those of you who are around when CSRA was passed, became effective in 1978, to try and improve government efficiency, they combined what used to be the Appeals and Review Board at the Civil Service Commission into two different agencies. One was into the MSPB, Merit Systems Protection Board, a brand new agency. They took it out of OPM. The Labor Department, where I used to work before CSRA, actually investigated unfair labor practices and resolved mostly union complaints, similar to what the FLRA did after the CSRA. And finally, OPM, which didn't exist, at least not by the same name. We'll see what happens. There's already a proposal under the first Trump administration to do away with OPM and put it into the General Services Administration, or portions of it would go into OMB. I wouldn't be surprised if you see some of those kind of proposals coming back again. That would have to be changed by a law. You can't do it with an executive order. We're also going to see executive orders coming out on what was last time called Schedule F restrictions for union representatives, and making it easier to fire federal employees. That's a guess, but I think it's a pretty good one. President Trump got a late start in his first administration. He didn't even get his cabinet nominated until several months into the administration. We already know who most of the cabinet nominees are now, and it's still another couple of months before he's inaugurated. So he's going to move out quickly. Schedule F in particular has upset a lot of people, or they have a lot of concerns about it. It was done late in his term. My guess is he thought that he would have a second term, and if that had occurred, then Schedule F would have moved forward. Obviously, he lost. Biden came in, and one of the first things Biden did was eliminate most of those executive orders that Trump had issued involving labor and employee relations. Go ahead to the next slide, Rich. These executive orders under the first Trump administration issued late in the term, and in my opinion, at least, Schedule F was probably the most significant change. What it would have done was create a new category of federal employees that could be removed at will. And in my article that I wrote recently, I quoted extensively from a man by the name of James Shirk, a really smart guy. He was working in the White House, and part of his job was looking at the civil service and the federal government. And I think he worked with experts around the government to come up with a plan for Schedule F. But they were learning. I think they had learned you can't just fire 50,000 federal employees. You're going to have to go through all kinds of procedures. It takes a long time. I worked at an agency, NASA, that went through a bunch of RIFs. And it's not quick. It's not easy. It may alleviate some of the pain that people go through who lose their jobs, but it's an awful process to go through. At least that's my opinion. And I think they discovered they were going to have to do that. If they're going to do it, I think you'll see some changes coming about fairly quickly. Now, OPM under Biden issued a new rule to make it more difficult to issue a new Schedule F. I suspect at a minimum, with all the negative publicity, Schedule F won't be the term that's used, but it really won't make much of a difference. Whatever it is, they want to create a system where they can fire people who they think are working against the administration accomplishing their goals. And right now, that's difficult. With this kind of proposal, if it went through, would make that a lot easier. One of the executive orders was 13839. It was promoting accountability and streamlining removal procedures. Those of you who work in employee relations know you have to go through a process to get rid of somebody. I've worked in I guess 5 or 6 different agencies over time. And in my experience, at least at that time I was in the government, there were always a couple of people you would wonder, what does this person do? And the answer was sometimes they sold real estate, sometimes they read the newspaper. What they did was file a lot of appeals. And the supervisor eventually decided, I want nothing to do with this person. I can't make him work. He's just going to complain anyway. So he has a corner desk and he'll be there until he can retire, which he can tell you the exact number of days until that date arrives. The Trump administration wanted to make it easier to get rid of people. James Shirk wrote an article where he talked about the number of people fired in the government as opposed to private sector. It's a very small percentage. And they wanted to change that to make it more like the private sector. And finally, there was an executive order to impose a hiring freeze. I wouldn't be surprised if you see something like that occurring again in the second Trump administration. It's if you have a hiring freeze, that cuts down on the number of people. And if you don't hire them, you don't have to fire them. So it's more efficient from that perspective. The problem from a personnel standpoint or management of an agency, of course, is if they need somebody to come in and do something and you can't hire anybody, then that job may not get performed. So I think as the Carter administration found out, the Trump administration is going to find out some of the same things. It's easy to make the allegation or make a promise we're going to reduce the size of the government by some number, it's harder to actually make it occur. Go ahead to the next one, Rich, if you can. Some of the changes that I think are likely to happen because they can be done, at least issued, won't occur right away, but over time they could. Charging unions rent for federal office space, limiting 25% of a person on official time, stopping reimbursement for travel expenses for hours appealing worker removals, and directing agencies to conclude their negotiations in less than 1 year. I'm guessing fairly quickly you will see a lot of these requirements coming back into play. A lot of agencies, reportedly, have negotiated contracts that last more than 4 years. And part of the reason they wanted to do that, the unions wanted to do that, was to get this into their contract. I'm confident we're going to see a lot of litigation coming out as these executive orders start to emerge, and probably some on these particular issues. That happened before. I'm sure it'll happen again. The philosophy of the administration has, if you're being paid by the government to do work for which you're hired, you should be doing that work. You shouldn't be working on behalf of the union. You can agree with that, you can disagree with that, but that's the philosophy. Go ahead to the next one there and reduce. Okay, this is part of the employee relations part, reducing the time to improve performance to 30 days. A lot of agencies where I've worked, it was 120 days. An article in the Wall Street Journal today said that the performance improvement plan process doesn't work. Several executives have said it gives a chance to get us to go to the press and say we gave the person a chance, he couldn't make it, he couldn't cut it, so we had to fire him, we had no choice. My experience has been that's kind of the same thing in the federal government, but most people don't want to go through the performance improvement plan. It's a lot of work, it takes a lot of time. That in itself leads to litigation, and you end up either putting the person back, maybe he'll do some work, maybe he won't, or they may get fired. It's not an easy process. None of this is that easy. Go ahead, Rich, to the next one. Okay. They've already said, this is from, I think, Mr. Ramaswamy. He wants to reissue an order to fire rogue bureaucrats. That was issued on October 21st, late in the, obviously the election was in November of 2020. And I'm quite certain the rogue bureaucrats term is, I didn't make that up. That came from one of the people who wants to reissue it. I think it's going to happen. They want to move parts of the federal bureaucracy outside of Washington, D.C. Trump was in the process of doing some of that in his first term. As usual, it led to a lot of litigation. Not that many people actually got moved. Had he had a second term, you probably would have seen a lot more of that happening. My guess is now that will be taking over the government as president in January, we'll see some more of that. He also wants to ban federal employees from taking jobs at companies they deal with and regulate. And I think in part this has come about because of people involved with COVID. As you probably know, Dr. Fauci retired recently with a net worth of 12 million or thereabouts. One person in the TSP has something like 9.5 million invested. We don't know who that is. It could be Dr. Fauci, it could be a number of others. But they end up with jobs at companies that they have dealt with and they've regulated. And that is something these regulators are going to be looking at through DOGE. And finally, he wants to have a constitutional amendment to impose term limits on members of Congress. I think that speaks for itself. He thinks that a lot of people have been in Congress for their entire careers. It's a gerontocracy. They want to stay there. They like the perks. They don't like necessarily going back to wherever they were living before. Perhaps if they're old enough, they want to be laying in state at the house after they die. A lot of that isn't good for the country, even though it's really satisfying. I guess what I wanted to make the point at the end of this presentation is how are you going to react to the change? I would say it's going to be an exciting time, but exciting doesn't mean it's fun. It's going to be, for some people, a lot of stress. Uh, we always have changes in government from a new supervisor, a new organization, a new administration. I served in the Army for a couple of years, and I thought I was the average American guy. And I got thrown in, as everybody does, I guess, when you get drafted into the Army, with a lot of people that I didn't normally come in contact with. Uh, a lot of guys from Harlem, a lot of guys from the coal mines in West Virginia, a lot of guys from South Texas, some of whom spoke English and some of whom didn't. So different ideas, different attitudes, different priorities, different life experiences. And a lot of them tended to be very blunt, uh, profane, if you will. And one of the favorite sayings was the guy from Harlem I was working with on some of the exercises. He said, the shit is about to hit the fan. And I knew exactly what he meant. It meant it. As we prepared to go to Vietnam, we were training in New Jersey in 20-degree weather, sleeping in a tent outside in the snow and ice, throwing grenades over a fence into the snow and watching it blow up. As you probably know, Vietnam doesn't have snow. They don't have ice. They don't have 20-degree weather. That would have been better training probably for World War II when you're going into Europe. Fortunately, I didn't go to Vietnam anyway, so it didn't make any difference. But when you say government efficiency, that seems to be, in the minds of some, that's what happens. When the CSRA came in, I was concerned at first. And what I discovered fairly quickly was there's also a lot of opportunities. It wasn't my job to tell Don Devine, this is the wrong philosophy. I was told by OPM, you're going to do training, you're going to go around the country, and this is what you're going to say. This is the philosophy we want to impart. We did it. I went from a 7 to a GS-14 fairly quickly by getting with the program, going out, giving the speeches, and doing what the administration wanted to do. I could have fought it, just as you will be able to, if you choose to do so. Now, for a union representative, I understand that's a lot different. But those are the kind of decisions you're going to have to make because, as the man from Harlem told me in the basic training class, it's going to hit the fan, and you don't want it to land on you if you can avoid it. But I think you're going to find, just as we did under President Reagan, a lot of what's been proposed won't happen. People are going to try to make it happen. Perhaps, as Mr. Ramaswamy indicated, he'd be able to get it through, or they'll be able to get it through because they have a majority in both houses of Congress. But usually you find that everybody doesn't, even if they're the same political party, they don't necessarily go along with the philosophy that you're expected to go along with. So it'll be an exciting time for you. Somebody asked me what was my agenda in doing this. As I said, I'm not in the Trump administration. I'm not in the Biden administration. I don't even work for the government and haven't for a number of years. My agenda is I'd like to get some good ideas for articles. I think labor relations is going to be more exciting. It gives us a lot more to write about. And if some of the people listening happen to want an article, write an article. We have a website at fedsmith.com, and you please go to it. If you go to the last slide, we have a newsletter that comes out as well. If you look in the far right, you'll see free email list. There's no cost. And two to three times a week, you'll get a newsletter if you choose to subscribe. And you can use twice. You can sign up twice, once with your work address, once with your home address if you choose to do so. But it's all free and you can unsubscribe at any time if you wish to. But those are the kind of things that I see coming. I hope it's useful to people, with the presentation, I mean. But Rich, that's all I have. I'm willing to try to answer questions.
Excellent. First off, I want to mention that Jim, have you put all right, so this presentation is in the chat room. If you click on it in the chat room, you can download it to your computer. And as you can see, there's a number of articles that were written by FedSmith that you can also look at. One that kind of speaks to exactly what Ralph talked about today is the very first article up there. These articles are interesting reads and again available at no cost to you. So we support the opportunity to share information, and that's what these articles are all about. Now we have a chat room, and Ralph, what I'm going to do is take a peek at the chat room
Okay.
and see if we have any questions that relate to concerns or comments that have been made. And let me read a few of them out for you.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Sam Mitchell, Legislative VP of NARFE, National Active and Retired Federal Employees, Hawaii. I'm a retired submarine mechanic and union rep at Pearl Harbor Naval Shipyard, which I have visited, in a very beautiful place. Could you send me a copy of this good presentation? So the answer is yes. And the way to do it is to click on it. If you have some difficulty clicking on it, or for some reason it doesn't work through the chat, we will also send the presentation to everyone who registered for the presentation. So that good question, and we addressed it. I have a general question just to kind of get things going, Ralph.
Okay.
Obviously, there was a lot of litigation about the executive orders, and I'm sure you wrote about that. And you know, the first iteration of the Trump administration, and the executive orders were pretty much upheld because they were kind of addressed in the wrong forum, is I guess a simple way to approach it. What do you expect to see from labor organizations when these executive orders are more than likely reissued or modified and reissued?
I think there are going to be more litigation. A lot will probably go to the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And I don't know how they'll rule on some of them. They may find, I think you're going to run into an issue of what does the contract say? This is a government-wide rule or regulation. It would have to go into effect at least when the contract is renegotiated. And it's been a long time since I worked in a servicing labor relations office. But I think even if there's not a good chance, the unions are going to go forward with it to try to get them turned around. The FLRA as it currently exists, there are two people at the FLRA who have a strong union background. One former colleague of mine who I worked with at the Labor Department back in 70 something, Colleen Keiko, was appointed by President Trump. And all it takes is 2 of the 3 votes. So as long as it's under the current makeup of the FLRA, the fact that a case didn't get through before doesn't mean it wouldn't get through now. And I'm confident that the union's legal folks are going to press that issue and try to get it through. On some issues, it's probably going to end up going into court. So it'll take several years to go through. Vivek Ramaswamy is also apparently already working with people to propose legislative changes. If that happens, it's a different ballgame. If they can get a law passed, that will take precedence, I think. But we don't know if that can happen. But I think they're going to try. And at the same time, the unions and other groups will try to prevent some of this from happening.
Excellent. Another question we have is from Saul Schwartz. Is it not true that a pre-existing collective bargaining agreement will override a new executive order? Therefore, it will be harder to order return to work. A pre-existing CBA may have telework in it, and the new executive order cannot override it. What's your view on that?
I think he's correct. And I think that's why the unions have been trying to get longer contracts. And I can't say that I've reviewed any of them. I have not. But they're smart people. So they're probably putting in because a lot of people like working at home, that's allowed. It may have restrictions, may have restrictions on the number of people. There may be processes to go through, but I think he's exactly right. The contract's requirements are going to have to be upheld, and I think that'll be upheld by the third parties.
Excellent. Another question from Greg Goldstein of FMCS. Do you anticipate any changes to the current RIF rules?
I suspect, if not, that's a mistake. I mean, if they can get changes through, it is such a complex procedure. And to be honest, it's been a long time since I worked with the RIF rules. I remember thinking, if this is ever happening again, I'm going to get a new job. It's just not fun to work with. It's so complex and it's so disruptive, and people are upset. I had a Chevy van, and I came out one morning and there was a bullet hole right over the driver's window. So I think some people, I don't know who would have done it, but the work I was doing with the union probably had something to do with it at that particular point. People are very upset. They get upset. So it needs to be quicker and it needs to be simpler. And I would hope the DOGE would look at trying to get that work done if at all possible. And a lot of it is through OPM. So once they run OPM, they may be able to get that done a lot quicker.
There is another question. It says the executive order must be specific in its language with regard to what it is requiring. The last term, the executive order was very specific with regard to CBA changes, official time, etc. I guess that's more of a comment, but do you have any reaction to that?
Well, I think the Trump administration they will bring back a lot of people that worked with them in the first administration. And I think they learned, and they're going to try to put specifics in. I know some of the people that came in had grand ideas and learned fairly quickly. We've got this whole system of rules and regulations that we didn't know existed, and they don't make a lot of sense, so we shouldn't have to follow them. But you have to follow them unless or until they're changed, or it's going to get overturned in the courts. And I think a lot of that's going to happen again. But I think James Shirk was instrumental in some of these civil service reform, I understand. And he's a smart guy, and he's learned a lot. And I think he's going to be relying on experts who know the system and will help write those new orders that may be coming out. They're probably doing it now, I would just a guess. I don't have any inside information, but I would imagine as hard as they're working on getting people nominated, these are the kinds of things they're going to be doing right now before they take office.
A very interesting comment and from Barbara Haga, one of our board members.
Hi, Barbara.
It was an insider, definitely, when it comes to employee relations. She knows everything there is to know about employee relations in the federal sector.
That's my impression.
There were proposed RIF regs issued at the end of 2020. Nothing ever happened with them, but I would expect they would resurface in the new administration. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to comment on that. But I'm also, I believe that it would be a good thing for our organization, SFLERP, to have some presentations regarding RIF regs, how all that works at some point in time, if it in fact becomes a issue that moves to the forefront in the federal sector. And we have plenty of folks who can speak to kind of the intricacies of how all that works, just to address the either real concerns or the perceived concerns associated with potential RIFs down the road. But your comment based on Barbara's telling us that they had stuff ready to go, proposed RIF regs in 2020.
So they're probably still there, and they can be revised quickly or reintroduced quickly.
Okay, any other comments? Do we see anything else, Jim, in the chat box that I have missed?
Yes, thank you, Ralph. Thanks everyone for being here. There was one, I'm going back to it. So, as you spoke about some of the potential changes and revisiting history, is there any information coming out that you know of, Ralph, regarding OPM retirees? Thank you.
I mean, insofar as the retirement system is concerned, not that I know of. I have not seen it. I do know that a lot of people are really upset. We get a lot of email or comments, especially on articles about retirement, how long it takes to process, and that it shouldn't take anywhere near this long. And some of the horror stories we've seen where it's taken several years for them to actually get a final payment. And then in some cases, OPM wants money back because they paid out too much. And I would think that kind of thing has to be addressed. A lot of people will probably remember OPM spent a great deal of money to try and put the system into computers so that you could process it online. You'd find out very quickly, I'm going to get this amount of money, and this is how long it takes. That never happened. And obviously, one person said, it's a government program. You know, it's not going to be simple or easy. And it clearly isn't simple or easy. There are so many variations in it. I think they kept running into issues to make it work adequately, and they never overcame it. I don't know if AI will be a way to do some of that. That seems to, at least from what our readers are telling us, that's one of the biggest problems and the biggest concerns.
Thank you, Ralph. I'd like to now turn it over to Keith to close our SFLERP Lunch and Learn for December.
Of course, and thank you, Rich, and thank you, Ralph, for harnessing your extensive experience to give us a sense of the path ahead of us. In this time of change, SFLERP remains committed to its role as the blended voice of management, labor, and neutrals in the federal sector. We look forward to seeing many of you at our symposium on March 13th and 14th, and at our periodic lunch and learns like this one, as we acclimate to the new administration's approach to federal sector labor and employer relations and collective bargaining. With that, I think this has been a wonderful program, wonderful questions, and an excellent presentation. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ralph, and we'll see you all next time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.